Okay, I just spent an hour going through all of the level 1 and level 0 through level 2 Bard and Cleric spells, and YouTube and the UCAM glitch, and didn't record it. So that's awesome, and I'm going to go through them really quick because, oi. Alright, so take 2. I'm going to go quick. Cliff's Notes. Duration is smaller. Alright, so basics. Basic point. Fate Core is about telling the system and not about playing a chess game with wildly variable things. A lot of the damage is going to be the damage tracking is simpler. Some spells are just going to be like, okay, you cast a spell. You've got that going for you. It doesn't really show up in the game mechanics. We just know that you have light. Your character there's not a list of prepared spells, so D&D and Pathfinder is basically about tactics, right? It's a tactics game, and Fate Core is about telling the story. And so a lot of things that are important to tactics, getting loot, racking up experience is largely irrelevant. It's side details in a storytelling game. So, hold on to that. If you're still trying to figure out how to play the chess, the player, the custom-built chess pieces versus other custom-built chess pieces, you're gonna get really frustrated. But we're gonna go. I'm gonna run through the level 0 through 2 Cleric and Bard spells, and kind of explain how to do this as quickly as I can, because I just spent an hour doing this. I'm using the Pathfinder Rulebook, so if it's a little different in D&D 5th edition, somewhat apologies. Okay, 0 level Bard spells. Dancing Lights. Mostly we don't care. Okay, I cast Dancing Lights, so you can have your zone illuminated or you can illuminate another zone, and nobody really matters. Unless it's opposed by something, there's no reason for a roll. You just tell us that you're doing it. We say yes, and we can keep track, and that'll help us tell the story. Daze. Basically, you are going to put an object, you're putting an aspect onto somebody dazed to lose their next action. Basically, what you're doing is you're going to create an obstacle, right? You'd use your rapport roll. So Fauna uses rapport. These are the Bard spells. You'd roll rapport, and they would have to overcome that before they could do something. Of course, you're going to have to continue to roll rapport to continue blocking them. So if Safana rolled a good and your ye old highwayman only good rapport for her spell, and he only rolled a average will or average will to resist, then you would have blocked them from making a move the next round. Okay. Detect magic, you'd use rapport instead of notice for something magic. Flare, dazzling one creature. This is creating an advantage. You make your lore roll, make your rapport roll. They would oppose it by either physique or will. If they failed, then they would have the dazzled aspect on it that you could tag against them for free. But the aspect would probably still be there for you to throw fate points on if you would need to buff something. Ghost sound, you're using rapport instead of deceit to do whatever you could do with deceit. No direction, you use a rapport roll instead of survival to find your way north. Light, again, mostly we don't care. Lullaby, there's 2 ways you can do this. This is either a create advantage where you want to put the aspect sleepy on them that you can tag, or you can do it as a mental attack where you're actually doing mental damage to them, and you can actually put them to sleep with a mild consequence sleep if you do enough stress to them. And that's going to be a combination of your attack roll, which would be based on rapport, and however many shifts of power you want to put into it, 1, 2, or 3. I think she's got 3, or yeah. That's how much weapons value on top. So if you broke even, you'd still do 3 stress. So if they only have 2, they only have 2 mental stress, which a lot of things do. They'd fill up their second stress box. They'd have 1 more. I don't want to have that finger up. 2 stress boxes. They'd have 1 more. They'd take a consequence. That consequence could be a sleep. Pop. So it's harder to put a consequence on somebody, but it can be a takeout. If they're not important enough to have consequences, then you can just take them out, and the takeout is described as they fall over asleep. Mending. All right. Mage Hand. For the most part, it's just going to be I pick it up with Mage Hand. Nobody's going to. There's no roll needed, no mechanics needed. If it really matters, then we'll look at the circumstances. Mending. All right. Now, because in Fate, everything in Fate Core goes what they call the Fate Fractal. Like if it's important enough to keep track of, it's got a character sheet, and the character sheet has same consequences the same way that you do. If it's not important enough to have consequences, then it gets taken out. So for a lot of minor things, this is just I mend it. Okay, it's fixed. If it's something that we're actually keeping track of, it's got its own sheet. Then and this is going to pay attention, so I don't have to repeat this because this takes place. It doesn't on all kinds of healing magic. Healing magic is way harder in 100 Kingdoms. One of the reasons is you don't have the fuel box, right? You don't have the constant going health gauge of hit points, and the stress every fight goes away, and unless you have consequences, which are really big deals. It's just gone. So there's no need for a lot of the little minor healy-dealy stuff. But I'll talk about how to deal with actual consequences. To get the healing process started on a consequence. There's a lot of stabilizing magic that shows up, in which case you just need to roll even with a consequence. So if somebody take a moderate consequence, which is 4 stress, and they're bleeding, you want to stop the bleeding with some kind of healing magic, you have to roll a great, right? If you want to actually start healing the wound instead of just stopping the bleeding, then you have to have enough shifts of power to fill up their physical stress box, which could be 2 to 4, and the shifts of the consequence. So a moderate consequence could be 8 shifts of power. That's really beyond a single person using affinity magic. This is something that goes into domain magic, which is more powerful, but we can talk about it now anyway. So let's say Evan Silla has four domain stress boxes and a great lore. So the very first starts with 4. It's so complicated. Okay. I really don't want to do this all over again. Oh man, I just said all this for an hour. Okay. First off, you have to fill up their stress boxes. So let's say somebody's got 2 physical stress, and they've taken a moderate consequence. So first, you need 2 shifts of power to fill up their physical stress, so that you can get their physical stress out of the way so that you can get to the consequence. Then you need 4 more shifts. So Evan can cast healing magic limited because it's going to use up his domain. And Evan's default first stress box for domain, because his domain's more powerful, starts at 4 shifts. So already you've got the physical and part of that. But he need to take his 3rd stress box, not his first, but his 3rd stress box, to be able to heal a wound, a moderate consequence on somebody using the way. And then what would happen is that moderate would drop down to a mild consequence, and it would be gone at the end of the next scene. Okay, so mending, mostly declaration. If it's got a consequence, I've told you how to deal with it. It's mostly beyond the easy reach. Although if you roll over like you keep pumping into a spell as described in the mechanics, then sometimes you can do mild consequences. Message, you've justified doing it, nobody cares. There's no roll needed. Open or close, again, depending on what you're doing. Either you're making a declaration, you're overcoming an obstacle, if you're picking a lock or something. You have to make your rapport roll equal or higher to the challenge of the lock, or creating an obstacle. Prestidigitation, minor tricks. For the most part, its declarations. If not, you're going to make your rapport roll against whatever level of difficulty the trick is. Read magic. Okay, you can read the magic. Resistance. You're you're creating an advantage. You're placing the aspect resistance on somebody that can get a free tag off of. Plus, it'll still be there if they can throw a fate point on it later. The default setting on that is you're going to need to roll a 1. You're going to need to roll average. Summon instrument. Summon one musical instrument. This is using your lore, using rapport instead of Sophana using rapport instead of resources, which would be the normal skill that you would roll to say, I've got an instrument. Okay, I might ask for a shift of stress if you're doing it in combat. First level bard spells. Alarm. Okay, you're creating an advantage on an area. Because it's an area, it'll take 2 stress outside of combat. That's completely irrelevant because stress goes away outside of combat. So you're just, okay, it's warded. You just have to make your roll. And that would represent, whatever roll you did, that would be what they'd have to get past your wards without sounding the alarm. Animate rope. Okay, that justifies you using a rope to do, using your rapport roll to make the rope either attack or defend or create an advantage or overcome an obstacle. Cause fear. That's just going to be a straight up mental attack. If you take somebody out, they've fled. If they don't get taken out but they have consequences, then it's fear. If it's a little, charm person. Again, 2 ways to do this. If you just want to place a friendly aspect on them, that's create an advantage, and you'd roll your rapport. They would roll their will or their empathy or their rapport to oppose it, depending on which one they want to do. Whoever wins, either the aspect will be there or it won't. Please tell me this is still recording. Okay, good. I didn't check last time, and I talked for an hour. Bloody. Okay. Comprehend languages. All right, you can talk to people. Confusion lesser. This is you're placing an aspect on somebody, or you're doing a mental attack, which is more powerful. In which case you're rolling your rapport plus however many shifts of magic, and they would defend with the appropriate skill. Cure light wounds, largely irrelevant, and we've covered the rest. Detect secret doors, use your rapport skill, cast a spell, say you're casting the spell, and then use your rapport skill instead of notice. Disguise self, use rapport skill instead of deceit. Erase. A mundane or magical writing vanishes. This is either create an advantage or overcome an obstacle, or if it's something important enough that we're tracking it, it would be modeled as an attack. All right, expeditious retreat. You cast a spell. Say you're casting the spell, and then you would use your rapport, maybe stress, depending, and instead you'd use rapport instead of athletics to defend or race somebody. Featherfall, you'd be using say you're casting the spell, and then you get to use your rapport instead of physique or athletics for falling. Grease, this is going to take stress because you're doing an effect on a zone, so that's 2 stress, and you're placing the aspect slippery on the whole zone. Hideous laughter, subject loses actions for 1 round per level. This is again that block, saying this is kind of the same kind of block as Flare, or you can do it as a complete mental attack, in which case it would last much longer than the hideous laughter in D&D spell. Hypnotism, the same thing. Your rapport versus their lore, either placing in an aspect for the short term effect of whatever hypnotic suggestion you were going to be doing, or you would be inflicting a mental consequence, attacking to put a mental consequence of hypnotized on them, which would be the longer lasting and slightly more dark side version. Identify for magic items. You're using rapport, your magic, Sophana's magic skill instead of lore. Magic aura, you alter your magic aura. Effectively, that's using deceit instead of rapport. Magic mouth, an object speaks when triggered. That's mostly story. Okay, it'll say when to speak. No roll needed. Obscure magic. This is either stealth or deceit. This would be an opposed roll. but it would let you make this spell justifies you opposing a magical surveillance roll. Remove fear. You're either overcoming an obstacle to remove an aspect from somebody, or that healing mechanic we talked about. Silent image depends on how you want to do it. The minor illusion would probably be you've put an aspect on something, and then they could be overcome by rolling against your roll. Sleep, that is a straight up attack. And if you want to do it as a zone, then 2 of the shifts of magic have to go into the zone. You can do it as a single target, straight up rapport roll versus their will or physique or their magic or their own magic. Undetectable alignment. Okay, this is use your rapport instead of deceit versus empathy. Unseen servant. Mostly, this is largely just going to justify different descriptions, right? I'm probably going to require stress for how long you want it to keep around, because magic doesn't last as long in the system. However, you can do magic all day long in this system, so there's kind of a trade-off. Effectively, with Unseen Servant and then the Summon Monster spells, you're justifying using your rapport, your magic controlling skill. So for Sophana, rapport, and for Evan would be lore, because that's what he uses for his magic control. For attack or defense, or overcome obstacle or create an advantage via the third party you're busy controlling. Ventriloquism, deceit. This is deceit instead of. All right, second level bard spells. The rapport instead of deceit. Second level bard spells. Alter self. Rapport instead of deceit. Animal messenger. This is rapport instead of contacts, or rapport instead of survival. Mostly it's create an advantage. Animal trance. This is a mental attack against critters, which lets you justifies you making mental attacks against creatures. Blindness or deafness, that is again temporary, momentary. That's create an advantage. You put it in you roll your rapport against you roll your rapport. They'll defend it with an attack. They'll defend it with the appropriate skill, either physique or will, or maybe athletics to avoid this spell, depending on the description. And if not, they get the aspects blind or deaf. You could do this as a mental attack or a physical attack, given that the aspect that you would create, if you put a consequence on them, it would be about being blind or deaf, and that would last potentially a very long time. So that spell is potentially much more powerful. Blur, attacks miss the subject 20% of the time. This justifies you using your rapport as a defense of whoever you've cast this on, or yourself. Calm emotions, you are using rapport instead of rapport. So that doesn't really matter. Cat's Grace, you're putting an aspect on somebody they can use for an athletics check. Cure moderate wounds, we've covered. Darkness, this is the opposite of light. It either is irrelevant other than you telling us, or it would be overcome an obstacle or create an advantage roll just using your rapport. I might require, this would be a 2-shifter because it's a zone. Daze Monster, this is either an opposed roll where you're going to try and take away their next action, or you could, you make a rapport roll for your magical effort and put whatever shifts of power you want into it. If you want to add duration to it, and they have to overcome that obstacle to make their, they would have to roll higher than that to continue to function. Detect thoughts. Oh, bard spells are creepy. Detect thoughts. This would be you'd roll rapport versus will. This would basically be an attack. Or create an advantage, but I would require shifts for that one because that's really powerful. So keeping that up would require I'd require you to continue to cast it. Eagle Splendor, you put an aspect on them that they can tag for rapport or provoke. or empathy. No, that'd be empathy. Would be more wisdom. And thrall. This is too powerful to really translate directly. You're basically putting a consequence, either taking them out as thralls or putting a thrall consequence on somebody who has consequences. Not all characters do. Remember, like big characters, they don't have consequences that they pick up. They're just taken out in whatever way that would normally give them a consequence. Fox's cunning. This is another aspect you give them. They would tag for something. Probably they would it would be an advantage they could use for some kind of scholarship or lore or will. Glitter dust. Blinding. Or outlines invisible creatures. You either you're creating an advantage. You're either creating a blinded advantage, or you're creating a visible advantage on somebody. Heroism +2 attack rolls, skill checks. Again, that's an aspect they can tag, and the tag on the aspect is going to be way bigger than the +2. Hold person. This is the same thing as Daze Monster. We've talked about that mechanic. Hypnotic pattern. This is depends on how you want to do it. Depends on the circumstances. How the roll would be. It'd either be an attack for a mental consequence, or an aspect they'd have to then overcome. Invisibility. This is using your rapport, and this would be using your rapport instead of stealth. Locate object. Rapport instead of notice. Minor image, rapport instead of deceit, or create an object mirror image. Mostly this is going to be create an advantage. Depending on how the situation is, that could vary. Misdirection. Don't know if that's going to show up a whole lot, but probably be rage. This would be create an advantage for somebody. Scare. We've kind of talked about it. Shatter. You can make magic. Attacks against objects or crystalline creatures. Silence. You're placing an aspect on somebody, or in. Sound burst deals a d-sun. So this sound burst justifies you making ranged attacks with using your magic. It can be 0 stress, or you can throw shifts of stress in. Suggestion. We've talked about it. That's take them out, place an aspect on them that is the suggestion. Would you'd roll your rapport and potentially put shifts in if you're trying to do a consequence or take them out that way. If you're just trying to put an aspect on them representing a particular suggestion, then it would just be your roll versus their roll. Summon Monster 2, again, this doesn't really change mechanically. You're putting shifts of duration into letting attacking or defending with your lore. Your rapport. Summon Swarm, ditto. Tongue, speak and understand any language. Okay, you do. No real thing. Whispering Wind, again, sure. Okay, fine. So that's the level 1. That's the level 1 through 3, 1 through 2 Bard stuff. If you notice that a lot of those, I'm just like, you know what? Those aren't even rolls. That's true. All right, level cleric spells. Evan, control stuff with lore. Bleed, again. If somebody has a consequence that's threatening them with ongoing stuff, to negate the ongoing harm of it, you just need to get a lore roll equal to the equal to the consequence. So, in a mild poisoned, and you wanted to use healing magic to negate the poison or stop the bleeding or ease the pain, then you have to get a fair lore for the spell, and that covers half a dozen spells. It's much simpler. Create water. Okay, you can create water. This would be using your lore instead of a resources roll, and you can pump more power into it, like you did to blow up the jelly. Detect magic. Use your lore instead of notice. If it's something magic, detect poison. Use lore instead of scholarship or notice. Guidance. Use lore. The guidance. You create an advantage. You put an aspect on somebody they can tag for. They get a free use for. Light, again, mostly it doesn't matter in terms of roles or mechanics. It's just nice that you let us know. Mending, we've covered. Purify food and drink, basically the same thing. It's either going to be overcoming an advantage if it's overcoming an obstacle if it's a real big threat, and you're going to have to roll your lore equal to or higher than whatever, however dangerous it is. Or it's mostly just, okay, it's safe to eat. Read magic, again, mostly just, okay. If it's a real challenge, then you'll have to roll your lore against the challenge reading. Resistance, you put the resistance aspect on somebody and they can tag it for something that would be like a saving throw, some kind of defense. Stabilize, we've talked about. Virtue, mostly that's just an aspect because hit points largely don't translate. Bane, you're placing an enemy on you're placing an aspect on an enemy you can tag against them, or you spend two points of power to put it on enemies plural, and then you can use against them plus water. Okay, totally. Cause fear. This is either a mental attack or creating, putting a different kind of advantage on the group, which we've just talked about. Command. This is Sithy, but this is either create an advantage, but more thrally kind of stuff is usually a mental attack where you've got to throw enough shifts of power that you overcome their will. And you overcome the will and inflict a mild consequence. And while the mild consequence lasts, you're in control. Comprehend languages. Okay, you've said it. Cure light wounds. We've talked about. It's complicated. Curse water. You make unholy water. Again, mostly whatever. If it's a lot, then I might require shifts. Death watch. This is using your lore instead of scholarship for medicine. Detect chaos, evil, good, law. This is using using your lore instead of empathy. Detect undead. This is lore instead of notice. Divine favor. You can basically skip the middleman, and there's two ways of doing this. If you're doing this for yourself, you can just roll an attack. If there's a medium that already has a weapons value, then basically you can pump the weapons value. So like if you have a weapons 2 thing and you cast divine favor, you basically roll it like a magic attack, right? You roll your lore and the weapons value. If you're using a weapon and you have the weapons value, you could theoretically stack them. It would depend on how you describe the attack. But effectively, you can use divine favor, and say like throwing stones would allow you to make ranged, justifies you using ranged attacks with magic. You can't cast fireball. You actually have to have 5 smooth stones to throw at Goliath, but you're still making a magic attack at Goliath using divine favor. And the only thing that changes is the description. And description matters because description is game mechanics in this. And make sure that it's still recording because man, I was traumatized by wasting an hour of my day. And I've got a 10-hour work shift I got to sleep for, so I keep going. Let's see. Doom, minus 2 on attack rolls. Okay, this is create an advantage. Would be you'd roll your lore, they would oppose it, and you'd roll your lore against them. They'd oppose it with their will or their physique or their athletics to get out of the way of the spell. If you succeeded, then they'd have an aspect that you create an advantage, which is an aspect that you could tag against them. And once again, you're noticing a lot of these turn into the exact same mechanic. It's really very simple. It's just the description adds some color to the story and helps me figure out when it will and won't work. Endure elements. This is lore instead of physique, or lore instead of survival. Entropic shield. This is a really cool one. The entropic shield, instead of rolling a bunch of percentages, the entropic shield spell basically means you are able to make a lore defense against range attacks. So, parry, this is the Jedi the Jedi parrying blaster bolts, and Tropic Shield basically is going to, rather than have actually parrying it, they just miss. It doesn't look fancy, but it's really scary powerful. Hide from Undead. You're using. Why didn't you cast that with the dead, with the skeletons? But Hide from Undead. You use your lore from stealth. Duration is not going to be a huge deal unless you want to do other things. As long as you're like just trying to maintain this, you'd be able to do it as you'd be able to do it as 0 shift, and you'd be making your lore roll instead of a stealth roll and going about your business. Magic stones. This just justifies you making ranged attacks with your lore. Magic weapon. You're placing an aspect on a weapon that somebody can tag once. Obscuring mist. Fog surrounds you. That could be any number of different ways. It's too complicated. It could be stealth. It could be create an advantage. Mostly it'd be create an advantage, or it could be an opposed roll. Your lore instead of stealth versus something trying to find you. Protection from chaos, evil, good, law. Again, you're creating an advantage. You're placing an aspect on someone they can tag once. Remove fear. This is either overcoming an obstacle where however good the roll is to put an advantage on somebody, you have to roll that or better with your lore. If it's an actual it's a mental consequence, then the healing mechanic doesn't change. It's still going to take a lot of shifts. Remove fear. All right, sanctuary. And that doesn't probably exist very well in this system. It would largely be justifying you making a lot of lore. You'd make a lore roll, and anybody who rolled that lore under just couldn't attack you. And as long as you didn't do anything, you could maintain it. Shield of Faith, deflection bonus. This basically, again, justifies you. This justifies you making defense rolls with lore, which is kind of huge. Summon monsters 1. Again, you're justifying. You're going to make attack and defenses. You'd have to put shifts into duration. It's not going to last anywhere near as long as it would in D&D. But you're making attack and defense rolls, or overcoming, or using your lore for that to represent your summoned monster. Second level cleric spells, and then I get to go to bed. Yay. Aid. +1 attack rolls against fear. Again, this is simply you're placing an aspect on somebody they can use. You roll it, and if it's opposed, you have to roll higher than whatever you're opposing. In general, you have to get an average lore. Given how high your lore is, same thing is true with Sophana's, you may be supercharging this aspect. Align weapon. This is placing an aspect on something, and this is mostly useful in making catches, right? In this system, all defenses and toughness powers, like the armor, has a catch. Something gets past it. I'm using studded leather armor. I'm blinding you with a laser. Yeah, no, that actually won't help. The armor value doesn't matter. And if something's weak against a particular alignment, then you can adjust it to the weakness with the declaration. You make your lore roll. If you succeed, the weapon will satisfy the catch. Augury. This is pay me a fate point, get a clue. Bear's endurance. You're putting an aspect on somebody they can use for physique. Bull strength, you're placing an aspect of somebody they can use either for physique or weapons or fight. Calm emotions, this is either overcoming an aspect, overcoming an obstacle, depending on how it's set up, or this is the whole mental healing thing, which is lots of shifts. Consecrate, fill an area with positive energy. This is either a story aspect, right? You've moved in there as your sanctuary, kind of a thing that isn't really done with personal mechanics, or it's going to be an area attack, or shifts to place an aspect on zones that you can use against the undead. Cure moderate wounds. We've talked about darkness. Either we don't care, or it's going to be create an advantage, opposed by perception or will if somebody wants to stop the cell. Death knell kills dying creatures. It's just a straight up attack. Delay poison, we've talked about. Desecrate, fill an area with negative energy, we've talked about. Eagle Splendor, okay, you put the aspect Eagle Splendor on them and they could use it for some kind of social interaction. Enthrall, we've talked about. Find traps, use your lore instead of notice. Gentle Repose, preserve a corpse, largely okay. Not a role, not a mechanic. Hold Person, largely this would be an ongoing conflict of your lore versus their will or physique, right? If you want to just be able to cast it and not constantly be wrangling with them, then you have to put shifts into how long it's going to last. Inflict Moderate Wounds, touch attack. Okay, now the Inflict Wounds spells just means that instead of using fight or weapons in melee, you can do magic attacks using Inflict Wounds. So lore and either 0 stress or however much magic you want to put into it. Now you're not going to be as mighty as a dedicated fighter who's always has a weapons 3 thing going on, but your lore skill is generally better than your weapons. So this is a great way to get around in combat. I mean, you've got the the defensive aura. What is it called again? Between Shield of Faith and Inflict Wounds, your character's base is effectively able to use lore as his combat skill, both for offense and defense. As long as it isn't something you just have to run away from, like a wall falling over on you. Make whole, repair an object. We've talked about Owl's Wisdom. This is just a different aspect that they can tag for a different use. Remove paralysis. This is overcoming an obstacle. Resist energy. Again, this would be just use your lore as your defense against whatever kind of attack or damage or threat. Lesser restoration. This is either overcoming an obstacle if it's just an aspect. If it's a consequence, we've talked about it. Shatter. Once again, you can make ranged magic attacks against inanimate objects or crystal people. Shield Other. This would be more powerful in this system, and using Shield Another would mean you can use your lore as a defense for other people. This is really scary. In case you're gathering that magic is way more powerful in 100 Kingdoms, magic is way more powerful in 100 Kingdoms. Silence. You're either putting an aspect on something with a roll, or you're putting this, because it's an area. This is 2 shifts. Sound Burst does sonic damage to objects. May stun the subjects. May stun them. This is that kind of word of power thing going on that justifies you making ranged attacks with magic in really freaky, creepy ways. Status. This is lore. Use your lore skill instead of I cast status. All right. Use your lore skill instead of notice or scholarship. Summon Monster 2. No change. Undetectable alignment. You're using your lore as a defense against empathy. Zone of Truth is really powerful. Effectively, you're either going to be it depends. This could be described a couple different ways. You could, I guess Sanctum would be kind of similar, but you're either putting an aspect of on a zone. Zone always costs 2 shifts of truthiness, and it won't last very long. Or you're using your lore to create an advantage against somebody where they have to tell the truth. Or you're doing a straight up mental attack and inflicting a consequence, and they're going to be telling the truth for a while. All right, so that covers the level 1 through 2 spells. I'm hoping that your characters aren't really powerful enough to justify using more than level 1 and 2 spells now, but are you getting the idea, of how this works? I hope so. If you have further questions, let me know. I'm going to upload this and then get the heck to bed.